A beloved veteran vanished mysteriously during a simple cliff walk, leaving behind unanswered questions and broken hearts for nearly 2 decades. But now, after years of silence, the truth is finally coming to light, revealing secrets that will change everything you thought you knew. It began on a misty autumn morning in Rock Harbor, Maine, the kind of morning where the sea fog rolls inland like a living thing, softening the edges of houses and trees and wrapping the town in a hush so complete, even the gulls seemed to caw more gently. It was October 17th, a Thursday, and, as he had every day for the past 12 years, Thomas Halstead pulled on his heavy flannel jacket, buttoned it slowly over his wool sweater, and stepped outside with a steaming thermos of black coffee in one hand and his walking stick in the other. The stick, gnarled from years of use, had been carved by a fellow veteran and gifted to him one Christmas, a token of friendship and silent understanding between men who had seen too much and spoken too little. His golden retriever, Baxter, too old now to walk far, gave a soft bark from the porch as Tom paused to scratch him behind the ears, whispering, "Be back soon, boy." He didn't know it would be the last thing he ever said to anyone in Rock Harbor. The trail that Tom loved wove along the cliffside, a narrow ribbon of dirt and roots that hugged the coastline, offering sweeping views of the Atlantic below. The path was old, marked by weathered wooden signs and patches of scrubby grass where the ocean wind never ceased its work. To most, it was just a pretty walk, but to Tom, it was something sacred. In those early morning hours, long before the world awoke, he found a kind of peace that had eluded him most of his life. Out there, with the rhythmic crash of waves and the cry of distant birds, his mind quieted. The memories of fire and jungle and blood receded, and he could just walk. But that morning, Tom didn't return. By 10 o'clock, when Marjorie Halstead realized his coffee thermos hadn't been brought back in for washing, a prickle of unease crawled up her spine. By noon, when he hadn't answered his cell phone, a flip model from 2004 that he barely knew how to use, she called their neighbor, Deputy Joe Kramer, and within the hour, a search party had gathered at the Cliff Trail's trailhead. What they found chilled even the most seasoned among them. Near the midpoint of the trail, just beyond the cedar grove, where Tom usually paused to look at the ocean, lay his thermos, still warm. A few feet away, propped against a stump like someone had meant to pick it up again, was his walking stick. There were no signs of a struggle, no skid marks over the edge of the cliff, no footprints in the opposite direction. It was as though the man had vanished into thin air. For a small town like Rock Harbor, such a disappearance was more than unsettling. It was seismic. Tom was not just another resident. He was a thread in the town's fabric. The quiet man who fixed your porch railing for the price of a thank you note. The guy who showed up at every veteran's potluck with cornbread and a nod. The one who didn't say much, but always made sure your generator was working before the first snow. And now he was gone, leaving nothing but two inanimate objects and a wife whose face had already begun to fold in on itself with fear. That first night, dozens combed the cliffs with flashlights and headlamps, calling his name into the swirling dark. The Coast Guard dispatched a vessel to scan the base of the rocks with spotlights, but the waves, thick with fog and seaweed, offered no answers. Helicopters came the next day, their blades thudding a slow rhythm above the trees, as if echoing the heartbeat of a town holding its breath. Search dogs sniffed through brambles and bushes. Divers took to the freezing surf. Nothing. Not a shred of fabric, not a boot print, not a cry for help. It was as though the sea had swallowed him whole and left no trace. Theories bloomed like invasive weeds. Some whispered he'd lost his footing and fallen into the churning surf below, his body pulled out to sea by the tide. Others claimed he'd staged his own disappearance, walked away from life, from responsibility, from the weight he carried inside that no one could ever fully know. A few speculated darker things: abduction, foul play, perhaps even the long arm of enemies from a war long past. Marjorie, steadfast in her grief and disbelief, refused them all. Tom would never leave like that, she said again and again. Not without saying goodbye, not without a word. Her voice never wavered, but those who knew her could see the silent collapse in her eyes. Days passed, then weeks. The search officially ended after 21 days, though volunteers continued combing the coastline on weekends. News stations came and went. Flyers curled and yellowed in the windows of the hardware store and post office. Eventually, time, relentless and unsentimental, began its slow march forward. Tom Halstead, the man who vanished into the mist, became a question mark at the end of a sentence no one could finish. But in the hearts of the town's older folk, those who had sat beside him in the American Legion Hall, who remembered the way his hand trembled slightly when he passed a cup of coffee, who'd seen the shadow in his eyes whenever someone mentioned the 4th of July, there remained an ache that never quite dulled. And in Marjorie's home, his favorite chair stayed untouched, the last book he read still resting on the arm, a thin line of dust gathering along the spine. She left the porch light on for 17 years. Not out of denial, but out of love. Because sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply refusing to stop waiting. Long before he became a name on a flyer or a whisper in the wind, Thomas Halstead was simply Tom, a man whose life had been divided neatly in two by the weight of war. Born in 1941 in a modest farmhouse nestled in the pine forests of New Hampshire, he was raised on discipline and decency, the kind he didn't talk about because it was just how things were done. His father, a World War I veteran and gruff mechanic, taught him to fix anything that could break and to keep his voice calm even when his hands shook. His mother, gentle and stoic, made biscuits that could mend a broken heart and never asked what he dreamed of because, in those days, boys didn't have the luxury of dreams. At 19, he left home for a mechanic's apprenticeship in Boston, but by 24, he traded wrenches for weapons and found himself deep in the jungle, fighting a war that even now, half a century later, America hasn't fully made peace with. Tom never spoke much about Vietnam. Those who knew him best, his wife Marjorie, his closest friend Walt, a fellow veteran who ran the bait shop down by the docks, understood that the silence was not emptiness but containment. What he didn't say held back more than words ever could. But there were signs, of course. Nights when he'd wake drenched in sweat, eyes darting, breath ragged. Mornings when he sat alone in the kitchen long before sunrise, staring at the wood grain of the table like it might offer him answers. Loud noises, especially fireworks, made him flinch almost imperceptibly. He never watched war movies, never joined the town's July parade, but he did attend the Memorial Day service every year, stood in the back, hand on heart, eyes wet, lips pressed together so hard they turned white. When he returned from Vietnam in 1972, Tom was not the same boy who had left. The world he came back to had changed too, less forgiving, more fragmented. He drifted for a while, picking up odd jobs from Maine to Michigan, unable to hold down work or sleep in a bed for more than 3 nights in the same place. Then one summer evening in 1981, in a small-town diner in Bangor, he met Marjorie. She was serving coffee, her auburn hair tucked beneath a blue scarf, her smile warm but cautious. She asked if he wanted cream, and he said no, but stayed 3 hours anyway, nursing that same bitter cup. They married 6 months later. He was quiet, she would later say, but he looked at me like I was the first soft thing he'd seen in years. Together, they moved to Rock Harbor, a sleepy town by the sea where Tom could breathe easier. He worked as a handyman, never charging more than was fair, often refusing payment altogether if he sensed someone was struggling. He rebuilt porches, patched leaky roofs, and fixed radios with hands that remembered how to load a rifle. Kids loved him because he listened more than he talked. Adults trusted him because he showed up on time and left things better than he found them. Marjorie started a small bookkeeping business from home, and in their quiet rhythm of shared chores and evening walks, the couple built a life that, while modest, felt solid. But the war never left. It lived in the folds of Tom's memory, tucked between the scent of diesel and the metallic taste of fear. Sometimes he would stand at the cliffs for hours, staring at the ocean with a gaze so fixed it seemed like he was waiting for something, or someone, to rise out of the waves. Marjorie tried once, early in their marriage, to ask about the jungle. He'd been silent for so long she thought he hadn't heard her. Then, with a voice made of gravel and ghosts, he said, I watched a boy bleed out, holding my hand. I promised I'd take him home, but I couldn't. I still see his face. She never asked again. Some truths, she learned, were too heavy to carry together. In time, Tom developed a routine. He would rise at dawn, brew his own coffee, feed Baxter, and take his long walk along the cliffs. The trail became his sanctuary. Out there, with the salt air stinging his cheeks and the gulls crying overhead, he could let the memories come and go without breaking him. He talked to no one, wore no headphones, carried no phone except for emergencies. He liked the silence, the kind of silence that spoke back if you listened long enough. Some mornings, he would sit on a flat rock halfway down the trail and scribble into a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. He never showed anyone what he wrote. Maybe poems, maybe prayers. In the years leading up to his disappearance, Tom had grown quieter, more reflective. He began fixing up the old canoe in the garage, though he hadn't taken it out in years. He started sorting through boxes of photos, lingering over some before placing them neatly into labeled envelopes. He went to the American Legion Hall less and less, though he never missed a funeral for a fellow veteran. Marjorie sometimes worried, asked if he was feeling all right, but he'd just kiss her hand and say, "I'm just thinking, that's all." That October morning, when he walked out the door, there was nothing unusual. No goodbye longer than the rest. No lingering gaze. Just the steady rhythm of a man who had walked the same trail 1,000 times before. And yet, that was the morning everything changed. That was the morning Tom Halstead disappeared into the fog, leaving behind a town that would never be the same and a wife who would spend the next 17 years staring into the horizon, wondering what kind of storm had taken the man who once survived a war, only to vanish on a peaceful stretch of land he called his own. In most towns, the missing fade like old paint on a barn. First a topic of daily conversation, then a subject for whispers, and finally, a ghost no one dares mention aloud. But in Rock Harbor, Tom Halstead's name never quite left the air. It hovered like sea mist in the mornings, clinging to front porches and Sunday sermons, whispered over poker games, and folded into evening prayers. Even after the search was called off, even after the helicopters flew home and the news vans stopped parking outside the general store, the people of Rock Harbor remembered. They remembered because Tom had made himself unforgettable not through grand gestures, but by showing up, again and again, for the small, invisible moments that made a town feel like home. At Dory's Diner, where he used to sip black coffee and eat fried eggs every Saturday morning, the staff left his favorite seat by the window untouched for nearly a year. A small wooden sign rested on the table, reserved for Tom. At the American Legion Hall, a faded photo of him in uniform, back straight, eyes solemn, was framed and hung beside the memorial for the fallen. During town meetings, his name still surfaced in conversations. Tom would have known how to fix that. Or if Tom were here, he'd have said something. In a place like Rock Harbor, the disappearance of a man like that wasn't just a mystery. It was a wound. For Marjorie, life contracted into a series of rituals, quiet and unwavering. She watered the flowers he had planted by the porch, even in winter. She washed his coffee mug and placed it back in the cupboard each evening. She kept his closet neat, his boots shined, and his spare jacket draped over the chair by the fireplace. The dog, Baxter, lingered for 2 more years, his eyes cloudy with age, always lifting his head at the sound of the door, just in case. When he passed, Marjorie buried him beneath the maple tree Tom had planted the spring after they moved in, and she sat there for hours that day, her fingers tangled in the roots. People checked on her, of course. That's what towns like Rock Harbor do. Walt came by every week with groceries. Pastor Lane dropped in for tea, always careful not to prod too deeply. But Marjorie was not fragile. She grieved with a kind of quiet dignity that made people want to stand straighter around her. She never held court in grief, never asked for sympathy. She simply waited. And it was that waiting, unyielding, unfaltering, that moved people most. Some said it was foolish, even tragic, but others saw something braver in her silence than in all the talk in the world. She knows something, old Mrs. Callahan once whispered to the pharmacist. She just won't say it out loud. As the years passed, The town changed as all towns do. New families moved in, drawn by the sea and the safety. The old mill was turned into a bookstore. Cell towers went up. Tourists trickled through in the summers, snapping pictures of the cliffs where the veteran vanished, the legend having grown with time into something just shy of folklore. Local kids dared each other to walk the cliff trail at night, half hoping to see his ghost, half afraid they might. But for those who had known Tom, the idea of his spirit haunting anything was absurd. If Tom Halstead's ghost was anywhere, Walt once said, it'd be fixing a gutter or petting a dog, not scaring teenagers off a trail. Still, questions lingered. There were no real answers, no clear explanations. Over the years, people speculated with growing creativity. Maybe he'd had a stroke or a heart attack and fallen into the sea, swept away before anyone could find him. Maybe he'd planned it, tired of the weight he carried, and walked off into some distant corner of the world to finally be alone. A few even whispered of darker things, abduction, or some military secret catching up with him decades too late. But the cliffside showed no signs of violence. The walking stick had been set down carefully. The thermos still steamed when it was found. It was the details, the quiet precision of the scene that haunted people most. It was too neat, too intentional. One cold November, 5 years after Tom vanished, the town held a memorial service. It wasn't a funeral. Marjorie refused that, but rather a gathering of memory. People stood in the community center beneath the yellowed photo of him in uniform and shared stories. Some were funny, like the time Tom fixed the school's flagpole with nothing but fishing line and a toothpick. Others were tender, like how he used to walk old Mrs. Grant to church every week, even in the rain. Marjorie didn't speak, but she sat in the front row, holding a folded flag in her lap, her eyes dry, her back straight. When it was over, she placed the flag on the table, kissed her fingertips, and touched them to the photograph. But she didn't stop waiting. Each year, on the anniversary of his disappearance, she walked the cliff trail alone. She paused where the walking stick had been found, stood at the edge of the cedars, and listened. Not for footsteps, or voices, or some miraculous return. No, she listened for something quieter, the wind, perhaps, or her own breath, or the echo of a memory too faint to name. Sometimes she brought a fresh thermos of coffee and poured it out beneath the stump, letting it soak into the earth. Just in case, she'd say to no one. And so the town moved forward but never quite on. Tom Halstead became a story passed from father to son, from neighbor to newcomer. His name etched itself into the map of Rock Harbor not as a tragedy, but as a kind of compass point, a reminder of the things we carry, the mysteries we live with, and the people we lose not in an instant, but over the long, slow turn of time. And through it all, Marjorie waited, not with desperation, but with a quiet knowing, as if somewhere deep inside her, she believed that whatever had taken him would one day give him back. It was the kind of early spring morning that fooled the senses, sunlight golden and warm through the windows, but the wind still sharp enough to sting your fingers. The sea shimmered like polished glass, and the gulls wheeled silently above the cliffs, as though even they were holding their breath. 17 years had passed since Tom Halstead's disappearance, and Rock Harbor had long since resigned itself to quiet remembrance. But fate, like the sea, has a way of stirring what lies buried when least expected. The call came just after 8 a.m., when most of the town was either at breakfast or making their way to it. Deputy Claire Morrison had been patrolling the eastern trailhead when a local hiker flagged her down, breathless and pale. He was a college student home for break, eager to see the cliffs after a storm the night before had cleared away weeks of lingering fog. "I think I found something," he said, voice shaky but urgent. I don't know. It looks old, like it's been there a long time." What he'd stumbled upon was no more than a half-buried satchel, wedged beneath a fallen pine just beyond the trail's edge, far enough off the main path to escape notice, but not so remote that it seemed intentionally hidden. The bag was cracked and stiff with age, its leather darkened by weather and time. Claire crouched beside it, her breath catching as she unfastened the corroded buckles. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had long since stiffened to parchment, were several items that sent a chill down her spine. A rusted pocket knife engraved with initials, TH, a weathered leather-bound notebook, and an old military dog tag, its chain tangled in the remnants of a flannel sleeve. News spread through Rock Harbor like wildfire. By noon, the path had been roped off, and state authorities were called in to assess the site. Forensics teams combed the area, gently sifting through soil and debris, careful not to disturb anything that might offer answers. Marjorie was notified before the press caught wind of it. She received the call at her kitchen table, where she'd been going through Tom's old letters. A quiet habit she returned to every March, as if the act of rereading his words might keep the waiting bearable. She didn't cry. She simply listened, eyes fixed on the window, where the first crocus buds had begun to push through the frost. "You're sure it's his?" she asked softly. Claire hesitated. "We're not certain yet," she replied. "But there's a notebook. It looks like his handwriting. And the tag. It's his serial number." Marjorie closed her eyes. Not with grief, not even relief, but with something closer to surrender. Not defeat, but the letting go that comes when what's long been frozen begins, finally, to thaw. The notebook, once carefully dried and stabilized, was turned over to her that evening. It had survived remarkably well, the ink faded but legible, the pages brittle but intact. She didn't read it at first. She simply held it, pressed it to her chest like one might cradle a bird too fragile to fly. For years, she had wondered what his last thoughts might have been. Whether he'd suffered, whether he'd chosen to leave, whether the earth itself had swallowed him whole. Now, within this small, trembling artifact, the answers seemed close enough to touch. The town held its breath. Reporters returned, old ones and new, faces she barely remembered and voices that spoke in practiced tones of tragedy and hope. But Marjorie remained quiet, refusing interviews, turning away inquiries. She did not want his story reduced to headlines or theories. She wanted to hear it from him, in his own words. And so, that night, beneath the amber glow of the kitchen lamp, she opened the first page. March 11th, it read in Tom's steady hand. "I don't know what made me leave the trail today. Something in the wind, maybe something calling." She kept reading, page after page, heart rising and falling like the tides he used to walk beside. He wrote of dreams, vivid, unsettling dreams of voices and faces from the past, of jungles rising out of the cliffs, of fire and fog, and the sound of boots in wet leaves. He wrote of feeling watched, not in fear, but in familiarity, like something old and unfinished was drawing near. Then, in the later entries, his writing grew more reflective. He spoke of memories surfacing unbidden, of the weight he'd carried for so long finally lifting, piece by piece. "I don't think I'm meant to come back," one line read. "But I don't think I'm meant to be lost, either. There's a reason I'm here. I just haven't seen it yet." And finally, near the back cover, a sentence underlined twice. "If I don't return, tell her I found what I was looking for." The pages didn't offer everything. They didn't say exactly what happened that day, whether he fell or walked away or simply sat down beneath the trees and closed his eyes for the last time. But they offered something more important than explanation. They offered intention. They offered peace. For Marjorie, that was enough for now. She lit a candle in the window that night, just as she had every year since he disappeared. But for the first time, it wasn't a beacon calling him home. It was a light to guide him on, wherever he might be. The notebook became more than an artifact. It became a thread, pulling at something that had lain dormant for nearly 2 decades, both within Marjorie and within the town itself. For days, she read it in fragments, letting each passage sink in like slow rain on dry earth. She didn't devour it in a single sitting. She couldn't. Some lines demanded silence after they were spoken aloud, as though reading them summoned Tom back into the room. Others made her pause, hand trembling above the paper, as memories uncoiled like vines around her heart. What struck her most was not just what he had written, but how. His words were not desperate, not rushed or fearful. They were contemplative, as though written by someone who had finally come to terms with truths he'd spent a lifetime outrunning. He spoke of the war, not in facts or dates, but in sensations. The smell of oil and burning grass, the way silence could be louder than gunfire, the way the jungle swallowed time. And then, almost without warning, he wrote of a man named Harris. Harris, the entry began, was the one I never talked about. Not to Marjorie, not even to the chaplain after the ceasefire. We left him behind, or maybe he left us first. It doesn't matter now. What matters is he came to me in a dream, clear as the morning sun, told me to follow the wind, told me there were things I still hadn't seen. The entry was dated 3 days before Tom disappeared. The name meant nothing to Marjorie at first, but it became a beacon in the text, reappearing again and again, always with a strange reverence. Saw Harris again last night. Same dream. He was younger than I remember, barefoot, standing by the cypress trees near base. He said, "Don't be afraid of the quiet, Tom. That's where you'll find me." The entries after that grew more fragmented, less concerned with chronology, more like Tom was moving through layers of memory instead of days. Marjorie read these parts over and over, piecing them together like a quilt sewn from ghost fabric and smoke. By the end of the week, she made a decision she hadn't imagined herself capable of. She went to the sheriff's office with the journal and asked to see the old case files, something she'd never requested in all the years that had passed. Sheriff Dawson, now retired but still respected as the town's quiet anchor, met her there. He looked older, his posture softened by time, but his eyes still held that steady calm she remembered from the day the search ended. "I want to understand," she told him, placing the journal on the table. "Not just where he went, but why. I think he was chasing something, someone, and I think it has to do with this name." Dawson opened the old records, dusty and yellowed, the paper brittle beneath their fingers. Most of it she had heard before, timelines, witness statements, maps with red X's and circles. But one report caught her attention. It was from Tom's military record, which had been included at the time only for context. A list of names from a reconnaissance unit in Vietnam. And there it was, Sergeant Paul Harris, declared MIA, 1971, last seen by his unit during an ambush near Quang Tri. The pieces clicked together not like facts, but like a feeling long buried. Marjorie could almost hear Tom's voice, low and weary, the way it had been on nights he'd sat by the fire after a nightmare he wouldn't explain. "Sometimes the dead don't want to rest," he once told her. "Sometimes they need something first." Dawson leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "It's possible," he said slowly, "that Tom never stopped being a soldier. Not in his heart. Maybe he thought he could make peace with something the rest of us forgot." Marjorie nodded. "But he didn't go to fight," she said. "He went to listen." That evening, she sat alone on the porch, Tom's journal on her lap, the breeze carrying the scent of salt and pine. She turned to a page she had marked with a ribbon. It was written in a different hand, shakier, as if penned under strain. "March 14th, it read. "I can hear Harris in the wind now. Not in dreams. In the trees, the water. I know where I need to go. There's a place just beyond the second bluff. Used to be an old lookout during the war. Maybe he's waiting there. Maybe I am too." Marjorie closed the book and looked toward the cliffs. She had never walked beyond the second bluff, not since the day they found his thermos. The trail past it was treacherous, overgrown, and long since blocked off. But now, she couldn't shake the thought that something of him still waited out there. Not his body. She no longer clung to that hope, but something else. A message. A truth unfinished. The next morning, she returned to the sheriff's office, journal in hand. "I want to organize a second search," she said calmly. "Not for remains. For understanding. There's more out there. I can feel it. Something he left behind." Dawson didn't argue. He simply nodded. "I'll make a few calls." That evening, word began to spread across Rock Harbor once again. A second search after all these years. Not to reopen wounds, but perhaps to finally close them. Some shook their heads. Others offered to help. And by week's end, a small team was gathered, old friends, volunteers, even a few local veterans who had served long before or long after Tom's war. And among them stood Marjorie, no longer just the wife who waited, but the one who now led the way. They gathered at the edge of the cliffs on a morning swept clean by wind and silence. The search party was small, but steady, 5 in total, including Marjorie. Sheriff Dawson had contacted an old ranger named Eli Carmichael, a wiry man in his 70s who'd spent much of his career patrolling the coastal bluffs and who still knew the hidden paths by memory, even the ones long removed from any official map. Alongside him stood Paul McKay, a younger deputy with a quiet reverence for the old guard, and 2 local volunteers, David Lindley, who had served in Desert Storm and now taught high school history, and Sarah Bramble, whose father had walked the cliffs with Tom years ago. They wore old boots and layered coats, their breath forming soft clouds in the cool air as they stared beyond the barrier that marked the official end of the trail. Just past the second bluff, the land became unpredictable, carved by decades of erosion and growth. Pines bowed low from wind, and roots snaked across the earth like veins beneath skin. The sea far below crashed with a rhythm that sounded more like memory than noise. Eli led the way, moving with a grace that belied his age, pausing only to point out where the old trail had once veered off, hidden now beneath brush and years of wild overgrowth. "Used to be an observation post out here during the war," he said. "Nothing official, just a place locals would use to spot ships or storms coming in. There were rumors the military used it, too, during the Cold War. Radar testing, maybe, but I never saw proof." Marjorie walked in silence, Tom's journal tucked in her coat pocket, his words echoing with each step. Beyond the second bluff, the lookout, maybe he's waiting there. She clutched the small notebook like a talisman, the wind tugging at her sleeves, the scent of cedar and salt thick in the air. The further they walked, the quieter it became, not from lack of sound, but a change in tone. The wind whispered lower. The birds kept their distance. Even the seas seemed to hush, as if they were entering sacred ground. They reached the crest of a rise where the earth dropped into a hollow, sheltered by a ring of trees that bent inward like guardians. There, partially obscured by time and moss, stood the remnants of a stone foundation, crumbled now, overtaken by roots and brambles, but unmistakable. Eli let out a long breath. This is it, the old station, or what's left of it. The group spread out carefully, boots sinking into soft soil, eyes scanning the underbrush for anything out of place. Marjorie stood still, letting the wind move through her hair, listening. It was strange, she thought, how silence could feel heavy, how it could carry weight, the kind that pressed against the bones. And then, just as she took a step toward the trees, David called out, "Here!" They gathered around where he stood, beside a large, weathered cypress. Beneath its roots, partially exposed by erosion, lay a wooden box no larger than a shoebox, wrapped in what appeared to be oilskin. Time had worn the edges, but it held its shape, protected by the thick roots that had grown around it like fingers. Paul McKay knelt beside it and carefully unearthed the object, his hand steady. "This wasn't buried by accident," he murmured. "Someone meant for this to be found." Inside the box were several items, each wrapped in cloth. The first was a photograph, faded, water-stained, but visible. It showed 2 young men in fatigues, arms slung around each other, squinting into the sun. One of them was unmistakably Tom. The other, by deduction and similarity to the journal's descriptions, had to be Harris. Behind them, the jungle loomed, thick and dark. Marjorie brought the photo close to her face, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. Tom's smile in that picture was unlike any she'd seen before, full of youth and unguarded joy, untouched by years of nightmares. Beneath the photo was another journal, smaller, older. She opened it, and the writing inside was different, less structured, raw. Harris's journal. Somehow, Tom had found it, or been given it. Or maybe it had been waiting here, just like he said. The first few pages were brief entries, coordinates, names. But later, as the dates neared his disappearance, the tone shifted. The final pages were chilling in their intimacy. "They think I didn't survive, but something in me stayed here. I see Tom in my dreams. He carries the guilt I couldn't shake. Maybe he'll come one day. Maybe he'll forgive both of us." The search party stood silent, the pages fluttering in the wind like the wings of a long-forgotten bird. Marjorie read the last line aloud, voice cracking. "If you find this, Tom, I forgive you. You did what you had to. We all did." There was no need for further searching. No body, no bones. Just this, 2 journals, a photograph, and a memory bound by time and redemption. It was not a grave. It was a monument, built not of stone but of silence and truth. Marjorie sat beside the cypress, the 2 journals in her lap, the wind threading through the branches above. "He came to make peace," she whispered. "With Harris. With himself." Eli placed a hand on her shoulder. "Looks like he did." They left the lookout as the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the cliffs. No one spoke on the walk back. There was nothing left to say, only something to carry. A story, whole at last, whispered on the wind that forever circled the sea-worn bluffs of Rock Harbor. Word of the discovery spread through Rock Harbor like a soft tide, slow but steady, rippling through barbershops, church steps, and diner counters. It wasn't the kind of news that called for headlines or blaring radios. It moved in whispers and nods exchanged over coffee, in quiet glances between neighbors who had long since stopped talking about Tom Whitaker out loud. But now, with Marjorie's return from the cliffs and the small wooden box in her hands, something shifted. It was as though the town, after nearly 20 years of polite forgetting, had finally exhaled a breath it didn't know it had been holding. Marjorie didn't seek attention. She hadn't brought back answers so much as she had brought home a presence, a sense that Tom had never really left. Not entirely. Sheriff Dawson arranged for the journals and the photograph to be scanned and preserved at the local historical society, not as sensational artifacts, but as quiet witnesses of a story the town had never truly understood. The original copies remained with Marjorie, placed carefully in a cedar chest that now sat at the foot of her bed, where Tom's old sea-weathered boots had once rested. In the days that followed, people began to come by her house, some with casseroles, others with nothing more than a folded note or a silent hug. Veterans, especially, came in numbers she hadn't expected. Men and women who had worn uniforms in wars spread out across decades. Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, sat on her porch and read excerpts from Tom's journal aloud, often pausing mid-sentence to compose themselves. One man, a retired colonel with trembling hands, looked up after reading a passage about Harris and said simply, "That kind of guilt, it's heavy. Some of us carry it our whole lives." A week later, the local church held a special evening service. Not a funeral, not a memorial in the traditional sense, but a gathering of shared breath and quiet remembrance. The pews were filled not only with longtime residents, but also with new families, young children squirming beside grandparents, each person drawn by something unspoken. Pastor Raymond stood before the small congregation, the wind whispering through the open windows behind him. "Sometimes," he said, "healing takes more than time. It takes truth. And truth, my friends, doesn't always arrive in the form we expect. Sometimes it comes in ink and old paper. Sometimes it walks through the woods for years before showing its face. And sometimes it sits quietly in the heart of a woman who never gave up." Marjorie sat near the front, the journals resting in her lap, her hands still and her eyes steady. When the pastor invited anyone to speak, a hush followed. Then slowly, one by one, voices rose. A mechanic who remembered fixing Tom's old truck for free the week before he vanished. A woman who had taught Sunday school and still remembered Tom's laughter during a community cleanup day. A teenager who had never met him but had read parts of the journal and felt, somehow, like he had. Later that night, Marjorie stood beneath the stars outside her home, the cool spring air wrapping around her like a shawl. She thought of how Tom had described the wind, that it carried voices, echoes of what had been left unsaid. And now, those echoes were everywhere. Not haunting, not sorrowful, but present, settled. She no longer heard his voice in dreams or in the sigh of pine branches, but she felt him in the way the town had softened, as though his journey had granted everyone permission to grieve what had long remained buried. The following morning, Sheriff Dawson returned with something unexpected, a letter. It had been found in a box of forgotten mail stored at the old ranger station, misfiled and gathering dust. It was addressed to Marjorie, dated 2 weeks before Tom's disappearance, written in a firm, familiar hand. He gave it to her, without a word, and she opened it with reverent fingers. Dearest Marjorie, if you're reading this, then maybe I wasn't ready to come back. Or maybe I finally did what I needed to do. I want you to know I never meant to vanish. Not really. I just needed to follow something I couldn't explain, something that had waited in the wind all these years. Harris was more than a friend. He was a part of me that never made it home. And somehow, I think he's been calling me, not in madness, not in sorrow, but in peace. I know this will sound strange, but I've come to believe there are places where time bends, where what's unfinished lingers, waiting for someone to come finish it. I don't know what I'll find. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But please know, I carry your love with me. It's the only light I trust out here. All my love, Tom. She read it 3 times, each line folding into her like a gentle tide, smoothing over the rough edges of long-held questions. She pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes, the scent of paper and salt and time rising like a blessing. In the days that followed, talk began of building something, perhaps not a statue or a plaque, but a simple bench near the second bluff, where the old trail split into silence. A place to sit, to think, to remember. The town council approved it unanimously, and within a month, the bench was built. It bore no inscription, just a smooth wooden backrest and a view that stretched into the horizon, where sky and sea met like old friends. People began walking the trail again. Not all the way, not past the fence unless guided, but far enough to see where the land curved and the wind began to change. Some said they could feel something shift when they stood there, like a whisper or a song half remembered. And always there was the bench, waiting. Marjorie visited often, bringing her knitting or a thermos of tea, sitting with her thoughts and watching the water. Sometimes others joined her. Sometimes she was alone, but she was never lonely. Tom had found his peace, and in doing so, he had left behind a space where others could find theirs too. As spring melted gently into early summer, Marjorie began a quiet ritual. Each morning after tending to the garden, the rows of tomatoes and lavender that Tom once teased her about, she would return to her kitchen, brew a single cup of strong black coffee, and open the cedar chest. She had placed Tom's journals and Harris's small book inside, along with the photograph and the letter Sheriff Dawson had brought her. But now, there was something new as well, something she hadn't expected to find. While dusting the old bookshelf in their study one afternoon, Marjorie had noticed a false panel in the back of the lowest shelf, cleverly concealed. Tom had built the shelf himself years ago, insisting on doing it by hand, despite her warnings that it would take twice as long. She remembered watching him wrestle with stubborn planks and warped boards, his brow damp with sweat and his mouth twisted in stubborn determination. When the panel slid open, it revealed a small, cloth-bound bundle of letters, tied together with twine so old it nearly crumbled at her touch. There were over a dozen letters, all written in Tom's handwriting, dated sporadically across the years leading up to his disappearance. None had ever been sent. Each envelope was addressed to her, Marjorie Whitaker, my home, but none bore stamps or signs of having been sealed. They were personal, intimate, often unfinished. She sat at the kitchen table for hours that first afternoon, reading one after another, the words unraveling like thread from a sweater she hadn't realized was still holding her together. In the first letter, dated just 6 months after his return from Vietnam, Tom had written, "I see Harris in dreams, sometimes, not as he was, but as he might have been. It's hard to describe. There's this moment, just before I wake up, when I think I can talk to him. I try to say something, anything, but I never remember what it is." Another letter, written nearly a decade later, revealed more. The war never ended. Not really. It just changed shape, became a shadow that follows me, even in sunlight. I don't talk about it much. Maybe I should. Maybe if I did, it wouldn't own so much of me. Marjorie felt each line settle into her bones. These weren't just letters. They were confessions, pieces of the man she'd lived beside, loved, and mourned in silent pieces. The Tom who came back from war had never been quite whole, and she had known that. But what she hadn't known was how deeply he had tried to shield her from it, how hard he had fought to be normal, to be present, to be enough. One of the final letters was the hardest to read. It was dated just 3 days before he vanished. Marjorie, I felt him again. Harris, not in dreams this time, but in the wind, in the pine trees beyond the second bluff. I know this sounds crazy. I know how it must look, but I think I have to go. There's something unfinished between us, something I can't explain. I need you to understand that this isn't about leaving you. It's about finding the part of me I left behind. Maybe if I find him, I'll find myself again. Maybe then I'll come back whole. If I don't, please forgive me. Always yours, Tom. Marjorie folded that letter slowly, her fingers trembling. She pressed it to her chest, eyes closed, and let the silence of the room cradle her. For a long while, she sat there, the low hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Then, with steady hands, she untied the twine from the bundle and placed each letter into a small wooden box Tom had carved decades ago, an old jewelry case, smooth with age and oil. She decided, quietly, that these words weren't meant to be hidden anymore. The next Sunday, she brought the box to the Rock Harbor Historical Society, where Ms. Ellen Draper, a retired librarian and local historian, had been carefully archiving Tom's materials. Ellen was in her 70s, with silver hair pinned neatly behind her ears and a sharp memory for names, dates, and details. When Marjorie placed the box on the desk and explained what she had found, Ellen's eyes welled with quiet reverence. "These belong to all of us," Marjorie said softly. "Not just me, not just Tom. They're part of this town's story, part of what we lost and maybe what we're finding again." Ellen nodded, running a gloved hand across the smooth lid of the box. "Would you like them transcribed for the archive? Maybe read aloud at the Veterans Day service this fall?" Marjorie considered it, then nodded. "Yes, but not all at once. One at a time. Let people sit with the words." Word spread again, and this time, it didn't come with whispers. It came with warmth. The Historical Society began a letter of the month, reading at the town library, where one of Tom's letters would be read aloud, accompanied by music and a moment of reflection. People began coming from nearby towns. Younger veterans listened with their heads bowed. Teenagers, eyes wide with quiet curiosity, heard a voice from the past speak with stunning clarity about things they had only learned in textbooks. Tom's words transcended the years. They did not preach nor dramatize. They bore witness. Marjorie attended each reading. She never read the letters herself. She preferred to listen, to let someone else carry the sound of Tom's voice into the room. And each time, she sat near the back, fingers laced in her lap, heart steady. One evening after a reading, a young man approached her in the library's dim foyer. He looked barely out of high school, with a Marine's posture and eyes that had seen more than they should have. "Ma'am," he said, voice quiet, "I wanted to say thank you for sharing his words. I didn't know how to talk about what I went through until I heard his." She placed a hand gently on his arm. Then he came back for more than just himself. And in that moment, beneath the quiet hush of yellowed lights and old books, Marjorie felt it again. That ripple in the world, that presence just beyond sight. Tom had not vanished. He had become a voice, living in letters, in memories, in the breath between sentences. A voice that would outlast even the cliffs. It was just past noon on a humid July afternoon when the knock came, a soft, almost hesitant tap on Marjorie's front door that felt out of place in the slow rhythm of Rock Harbor. She'd been slicing cucumbers for a salad, the kitchen windows open to let in the warm breeze and the distant hum of cicadas. Wiping her hands on a dish towel, she moved to the door, expecting perhaps Ellen Draper with more letters from the archive, or maybe young Timmy from next door returning her garden shears. But when she opened it, what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. There stood a man who looked like time had carved him from the same winds that had shaped the cliffs. His hair, once a solid brown, was now salt and pepper, but the deep-set eyes were unmistakable, calm, intelligent, and haunted. He was thinner than she remembered, his posture still carrying the slight forward lean of a soldier used to packs on his back. His hands were calloused, his boots worn, and slung over one shoulder was a battered canvas bag. "Marjorie," he said quietly, voice rough from disuse but steady. "It's been a while." She didn't speak. Couldn't. For several heartbeats, she just stared, the world narrowing until it was only the space between them, the porch boards beneath their feet, the soft wind in the leaves. Then, as though something inside her finally allowed her lungs to work again, she exhaled. "Tom." He gave the barest of nods. I made it back." And then she was in his arms, her face against his chest, his scent a blend of pine, earth, and something else, something old and familiar. Tears came freely, hers and his, and they stood there for a long time, without speaking, letting the years fall away like dust from a forgotten coat. When they finally moved inside, Marjorie noticed how carefully he stepped through the threshold, like a man entering sacred ground. He looked around slowly, eyes lingering on the photographs on the mantel, the furniture she had rearranged, the blanket she had crocheted and draped across his old reading chair. Everything was both the same and different, and she could see him cataloging each change as if reconciling a memory with a dream. They sat at the kitchen table, two steaming mugs between them, her hands curled around hers, his fingers restless against the ceramic. For a while, neither spoke. It wasn't awkward. It was reverent. "Where have you been, Tom?" she finally asked, voice no louder than a prayer. He looked down, then up again, as if searching for the right beginning. "Out there," he said, "off the trail, past the second bluff. I found the place, Harris's place. It wasn't just in my head. There was something real, or as real as anything gets when you're chasing ghosts." He explained, slowly, how he had followed a pull he couldn't explain, how the memories and guilt had driven him further than he'd meant to go. He spoke of a clearing deep in the forest, where the cliffs bent and the trees grew older than any around Rock Harbor. Of a fire pit long buried beneath moss, a rusted dog tag he'd unearthed, and a notebook, Harris's notebook, tucked inside an old ammo canister, sealed against time. It had taken him days to find it, longer still to believe it. "There were letters," Tom said, his voice breaking. "Letters Harris wrote to his mother. To me. Some of them he never sent. He was planning to come back. He just didn't know how. And then, he never got the chance." Marjorie reached across the table and took his hand. It was warm, solid. "You found peace out there?" He nodded. "Eventually. But it took longer than I expected. I built a small shelter, nothing fancy. Lived quiet. Read. Wrote. Thought a lot. I told myself I'd only be gone a few weeks. But then I kept finding reasons not to return. Guilt. Fear. Shame. I convinced myself the world had moved on. That maybe you had too." She shook her head, her voice firm. "I never stopped waiting. Not a day." They sat in silence again, letting the weight of 2 decades settle between them without crushing them. Tom's eyes roamed to the cedar chest in the corner of the room. "You found the journals?" Marjorie smiled gently. "And the letters you left behind the bookshelf? I read them all." A faint blush crept into his weathered cheeks. "I wasn't sure you would." "I did," she whispered. "Every word." Tom let out a long breath, something like relief threading through it. "I came back because I finally realized I wasn't just looking for Harris out there. I was trying to find the part of me that could still come home. I didn't know if it was still here or if you were." "I was," she said simply. "I always was." That evening, the sun dipped low, casting amber light across the kitchen walls. Marjorie made dinner, roasted chicken with rosemary, mashed potatoes, and green beans from her garden. Tom ate slowly, savoring each bite as if food were a new language he was relearning. They talked late into the night, sharing not only stories of the past, but dreams for what might still come. Before they went to bed, 2 separate bedrooms, for now, Tom stood at the front door, gazing out at the quiet street. "It's changed," he murmured, "but it still feels like home." Marjorie stepped beside him. "You're home now, Tom, and we'll figure out the rest together." He looked at her, and in that look was everything: sorrow, gratitude, Love long delayed, but not lost. Then, for the first time in nearly 20 years, he smiled. Not the polite curve of lips he used to wear in photographs, but a real smile, worn and weathered and beautiful. Outside, the stars began to emerge, one by one, like lights returning to a town that had waited a long, long time. The days that followed Tom's return were like the slow thaw after a long winter. The small town of Rock Harbor, with its weathered boardwalks and familiar faces, seemed to welcome him back with a gentle, unspoken forgiveness. Marjorie found herself waking each morning beside him, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath, a rhythm she hadn't known was missing until it returned. Tom's presence filled the house, but it wasn't the man who had vanished years ago, the haunted soldier trapped between memories and silence. This was a man seeking repair, desperate to stitch the torn fabric of his life with threads of hope and grace. They spent hours in quiet conversation, some of it tentative, some bursting with the long-suppressed emotions of decades. Tom confessed that the forest retreat, the refuge he had built near the cliffs, was not just a hiding place, but a crucible for facing his darkest moments. The isolation stripped away the noise and distraction, forcing him to confront the shadows of war, of loss, and of himself. Each day was a battle between despair and the fragile light of healing. "It's strange," Tom admitted one afternoon as they sat on the porch, watching the sun slip behind the trees, "how the past clings to you, like ivy on stone. You try to pull it away, but it's woven too deep. You think leaving will break the grip, but it only tightens." Marjorie nodded, understanding. She too had carried scars, though quieter ones, lonely nights, unanswered questions, and a heavy silence Tom left behind. But now, with him home, they could face those wounds together. One afternoon, Tom took her to the edge of the second bluff, the very place where the wind whispered secrets and the sea crashed below with relentless power. He showed her the clearing where he had found Harris's dog tag, half buried beneath moss and pine needles. It was a solemn, sacred place, a shrine to a friendship forged in fire and tragedy. Together, they placed a small plaque there, engraved with Harris's name and a quote from one of his letters. "In the darkest moments, friendship is the light that never fades." The plaque was simple, weathered like the cliffs, yet it held the weight of years of pain and love. Returning home, they worked on making peace with the past. Tom began to share more of the stories he'd buried. The fear in the jungles of Vietnam, the nights spent watching stars instead of sleeping, the whispered names of friends lost too soon. Marjorie listened without judgment, her presence a balm to the wounds he had long carried alone. In turn, she shared the life she had built, the garden she had tended, the community she had grown into. Tom learned of the neighbors who had watched over her, the friends who had become family, and the quiet rituals that marked each season. It was as if two parallel lives were weaving into one again, fragile yet unbreakable. The town, too, embraced Tom's return. Some looked on with cautious hope, others with quiet curiosity, but most with a shared understanding born of knowing loss and waiting for healing. At the local diner, where Marjorie often had her morning coffee, people nodded and smiled, offering small gestures of welcome. Tom began attending the veterans' meetings again, sitting quietly at first, then gradually speaking up. He found a group of men and women who shared his experiences, each with their own stories of silence and survival. In their company, Tom's burden lightened, and he realized that healing was not a solitary journey, but one traveled alongside others. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting golden light over the harbor, Tom and Marjorie stood hand in hand, watching the boats bobbing gently in the water. The horizon was a wash of color, pink, orange, and violet. And for the first time in a long while, Tom spoke of the future with hope. "I want to write again," he said softly. "Not just letters hidden away, but stories that matter. About Harris, about the men who didn't come home, about the things we don't say out loud." Marjorie squeezed his hand, her heart full. "Then write, Tom. We'll be here to listen." The night grew deep, but the warmth between them lingered, an ember glowing against the dark, a promise that the past, no matter how heavy, could be honored without holding them captive. The cliffs stood silent witnesses, the sea's eternal song a reminder that life moves forward, even when marked by loss. And in that quiet moment, beneath the vast sky, healing began, not as a sudden spark, but as a slow, steady light growing stronger with each shared memory, each spoken word, each tender embrace. The discovery of Harris's notebook had opened a door that Tom and Marjorie could not close. Every day, as Tom read through the carefully penned entries by his lost friend, he felt the weight of silence begin to lift. The pages revealed not only the brutality of their shared experience, but also the small, fragile moments of hope that had kept Harris going. Yet, amid the reflections and memories, there was one entry that puzzled Tom, a cryptic note about a secret meeting and a final choice that had haunted Harris until the end. One rainy afternoon, Tom and Marjorie sat in the cozy living room, the soft patter of raindrops against the windows forming a quiet backdrop. Tom traced the faded ink on the page with a finger, the words whispering secrets decades old. "It's as if Harris wanted to tell me something important, but he never could," he murmured. Something about what happened on the cliff walk, something they wanted to hide. Marjorie looked up, concern knitting her brow. "Do you think this could explain why you disappeared? Why no one found you?" Tom nodded slowly, the lines of worry deepening on his face. "I think there was more to that day than I ever realized. More than just an accident or a rescue gone wrong. Something that someone didn't want uncovered." Fueled by a mixture of curiosity and the need for closure, they began to dig deeper into the town's archives, old newspapers, and interviews with those who had been around in the early days after Tom's disappearance. The local library became their second home, the dusty records and yellowed photographs providing pieces of a puzzle long left unsolved. They learned about a series of strange events reported near the cliffs, accounts of suspicious men, unmarked vehicles, and whispered warnings that scared even the bravest locals into silence. The community had been tight-lipped, bound by fear and loyalty, protecting secrets that could destroy reputations and lives. One evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple, Marjorie found a name buried in an old police report: Agent Caldwell. The name resonated with a cold authority, a man reputed to be involved in covert operations during the war, a man who had ties to military intelligence and had been seen in Rock Harbor shortly before Tom's disappearance. The discovery sent a chill through both of them. If Harris's final choice was connected to Agent Caldwell, it suggested that the truth was tangled in something far bigger than a lost soldier's fate. It hinted at betrayal, cover-ups, and a silent war fought not only overseas, but within the very fabric of their community. Determined to uncover the truth, Tom reached out to old contacts, veterans who might remember Caldwell or the mysterious activities around the cliffs. Some were hesitant, others frightened to speak, but slowly, stories emerged, stories of a mission gone wrong, of orders given and ignored, of men sacrificed for secrets too dangerous to reveal. As the pieces came together, Tom and Marjorie realized that their fight was no longer just about memory or mourning. It was about justice and reclaiming the truth stolen from them. The Cliff Walk, once a place of beauty and peace, was now a battleground of hidden history. The emotional toll was heavy. Tom grappled with anger and betrayal, questioning everything he had believed about his comrades and the government he had served. Marjorie's heart ached with the weight of the past, reopening wounds she had tried to heal. Yet through it all, their bond deepened. They leaned on each other, finding strength in shared resolve and quiet moments of tenderness. The truth, as painful as it was, became a light guiding them out of the shadows. Late one night, as they sat by the fire, Tom closed the notebook and looked at Marjorie with a weary but determined gaze. "We owe it to Harris, to all of them. We have to tell the story." Marjorie nodded, her voice steady despite the fatigue. "We will. Together." Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and ready for the dawn. The path to uncovering the truth about Harris and the Cliff Walk was anything but smooth. For Tom and Marjorie, The weeks that followed were marked by frustration, setbacks, and the slow grind of peeling back layers of decades-old secrecy. They found themselves navigating a maze of bureaucracy, veiled threats, and the stubborn reluctance of some who preferred the past remain buried. At first, their inquiries were met with polite dismissals. Officials cited missing files, faded memories, and the impossibility of reopening wounds from so long ago. But Tom, with his veteran's tenacity, refused to give up. He started gathering statements from those who had served alongside him in Harris, collecting whatever scraps of evidence might add weight to their cause. Marjorie, too, became his unwavering partner, handling interviews, sorting documents, and encouraging him when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm. One afternoon, they met with a retired military officer who had once been stationed near Rock Harbor. His name was Colonel James Foster, a man known for his integrity and courage. Foster listened intently as Tom recounted what they had found. The notebook, the suspicious activities, the name of Agent Caldwell. When Tom finished, Foster's expression grew grim. "I remember Caldwell," Foster said slowly. "He was involved in some of the most sensitive intelligence operations during the war. People were afraid of him. What you're uncovering is dangerous territory." Despite the warnings, Foster agreed to provide them with access to some classified documents he still had in his possession. Together, they pored over yellowed papers, maps, and coded messages. One file stood out, a report detailing a covert mission that coincided exactly with the day Tom disappeared. The mission had gone off the official records, dismissed as a lost cause and never publicly acknowledged. It was a revelation that changed everything. The government had knowingly sent men into peril without backup or support, and when things went wrong, those men were written off. Harris, it seemed, had been trying to expose this betrayal through his notes, risking his own safety to make sure someone would know the truth. Word of their investigation began to spread in Rock Harbor. Some neighbors offered quiet support, while others looked away, unwilling to revisit painful memories. The local newspaper ran a story about Tom's return and his quest for answers, stirring both sympathy and controversy. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Tom and Marjorie sat on their porch, weary but resolute. "We've come so far," Marjorie said softly, "but there's still so much resistance. It's like fighting ghosts." Tom nodded. "I know, but I can't let this go. For Harris, for the others who never got a voice, and for the families left in silence." They decided to take their findings to a veterans advocacy group in the near city. With legal advice and public support, they filed a petition demanding a formal investigation. It was a bold step and not without risks. Threatening letters arrived, and once, a shadowy figure was spotted near their home. But the community rallied, emboldened by Tom's courage and Marjorie's steadfast presence. Months passed. The investigation gained momentum. Officials who had once dismissed their claims were forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Testimonies were gathered, documents declassified, and the story that had been buried for nearly 20 years began to emerge into the light. For Tom, the process was both cathartic and painful. He faced memories he had long tried to suppress. The faces of comrades lost, the fear in his own eyes, the betrayal of trust. But he also found solace in knowing that justice might finally be served. Marjorie remained by his side, her quiet strength a constant source of comfort. Together, they attended hearings, met with reporters, and spoke openly about the cost of silence. Their story became a beacon for other veterans and families seeking truth and reconciliation. One day, as they stood before a panel of government officials, Tom felt the weight of the past lift just a little. The truth was no longer hidden. It was out there, acknowledged and respected. After the hearings, as they walked back through the old town square, a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and sea. Tom looked at Marjorie and smiled, a smile that held both gratitude and a promise. "We did it," he said. She squeezed his hand. "We're not done yet, but this is a start." The cliffs still stood, silent witnesses to the passage of time. But now, the story of Harris, Tom, and the others would not be forgotten. Their courage had carved a path from darkness to light, a legacy of truth that would endure for generations. The days after the official hearings felt like waking from a long, troubled dream. For Tom and Marjorie, the air was lighter, though the weight of the past still lingered like a distant echo. The truth was finally out, public, undeniable, and it began to ripple through the community, stirring reflection and healing. Tom found himself invited to speak at local schools and veteran gatherings, sharing not just the story of the Cliff Walk, but the deeper lesson about courage, loss, and the power of truth. His voice, once silenced by trauma, now carried the strength of experience and the wisdom that only time could forge. The younger generations listened, many with wide eyes, absorbing the history that textbooks never told them. Marjorie, too, felt the shift. The town's quiet support grew into something tangible, a renewed sense of connection among neighbors, families, and old friends. The garden she tended bloomed brighter, a symbol of renewal that mirrored the community's own healing. She and Tom worked side by side planting new flowers, their hands dirty but hearts hopeful. One crisp autumn morning, Tom visited the cliff clearing where they had placed a plaque for Harris. The sea below churned with steady waves, and the wind whispered softly through the pines. He knelt beside the marker, tracing the engraved words with reverence. Memories surged, Harris's laughter, their shared fears, and the promises they made in the face of uncertainty. Tom whispered, "We did it, old friend. Your story won't be forgotten." The cliffs, timeless and stoic, seemed to absorb the words, a solemn witness to a friendship that transcended time and tragedy. The healing process was not without challenges. Tom's nightmares still visited him, sometimes fierce and unrelenting. Marjorie held him through the darkest hours, her presence a steady anchor. They sought therapy together, breaking the silence around mental health, a topic often avoided in their generation. Slowly, the darkness loosened its grip, replaced by moments of peace and clarity. In the evenings, they would sit by the fireplace, sharing stories both new and old. Laughter returned to their home, gentle and genuine. Their bond deepened, shaped by pain but strengthened by love. They spoke of dreams long deferred and made plans for a future that no longer seemed uncertain. One day, Tom received a letter from a family he had never met, relatives of a soldier lost on the same mission. The letter was simple but profound, expressing gratitude for his courage and the hope that the truth would bring closure. It was a reminder that their fight was bigger than themselves, a thread in a vast tapestry of sacrifice and remembrance. With renewed purpose, Tom and Marjorie organized a memorial event at the cliffs. Veterans, families, and townspeople gathered to honor those who had been lost and to celebrate the resilience of those who remained. The ceremony was filled with tears and smiles, silence and song, a poignant tribute to lives forever changed but never forgotten. As the sun set that day, casting golden hues over the sea, Tom and Marjorie stood hand in hand. The journey had been long and arduous, marked by loss and revelation, but they had found something precious, hope reborn from the ashes of sorrow. In the quiet moments that followed, Tom looked at Marjorie and said, "Thank you for never giving up on me, on us." Her eyes glistened with tears as she replied, "We're stronger together. Always." The cliffs held their secrets no more. Instead, they stood as a testament to truth, courage, and the enduring power of love, reminding all who walked their paths that even in the darkest places, light could be found. The years following the memorial event brought a quiet but profound change to Rock Harbor. The once shadowed cliffs had become a place of pilgrimage, not just for veterans and their families, but for anyone seeking a reminder of courage, resilience, and the price of truth. Tom and Marjorie, now regarded as pillars of the community, continued to nurture the legacy they had fought so hard to reveal. Tom's health, though weathered by time and memory, had improved with the steady support of Marjorie and the peace that truth had brought. They spent mornings walking the cliff paths together, watching the sun rise over the ocean, the salt air filling their lungs with the promise of new days. Each step was a tribute, not only to Harris and those lost, but to the spirit that had refused to be broken. In quiet moments, Tom often reflected on the long journey from disappearance to discovery. The years of uncertainty, the loneliness of being presumed gone, the slow unraveling of secrets, all woven together in a tapestry of pain and hope. He realized that while the scars of the past would never fully fade, the act of sharing his story had transformed the wounds into something meaningful. Marjorie's presence remained his steadfast anchor. Her gentle laughter and unwavering belief had carried him through the darkest nights. Together, they had not only uncovered a hidden truth, but had rebuilt a life grounded in love and resilience. Their story became one of healing, a reminder that even when the past is heavy, the future can still hold light. The town embraced the changes with quiet reverence. Schools included the story of the Cliff Walk in their history lessons, ensuring that generations to come would remember not just the names and dates, but the human faces behind them. Veterans found renewed camaraderie, and families once torn by silence found comfort in shared remembrance. Tom and Marjorie began to work on a book chronicling the entire saga: the disappearance, the search, the revelations, and the healing. It was a labor of love, written with the intention of giving voice to those who had been silenced for so long. The book was more than a memoir. It was a testament to endurance and the power of truth to set us free. The day the book was published was one of quiet celebration. Friends, neighbors, and strangers alike gathered in the local hall, listening as Tom read passages aloud. His voice, steady and filled with emotion, carried the weight of history and the light of redemption. Tears and smiles mingled in the room, a shared acknowledgement of a journey that had touched so many lives. As twilight settled over Rock Harbor, Tom and Marjorie stood once again at the edge of the cliffs. The sea below roared with timeless energy, and the wind carried the echoes of the past, mingling with the hopes of tomorrow. They held hands, feeling the pulse of a story finally at peace. "Do you think Harris will be proud?" Marjorie asked softly. Tom smiled, the lines of age deepening around his eyes. "I think he already is, because his truth lives on." Their legacy, forged through decades of loss and discovery, would endure, reminding all who heard it that even the darkest mysteries can be illuminated by courage and love. The cliffs would stand silent no more, their shadows replaced by light, their stories carried forward on the breath of the wind. And so, the tale of the veteran who disappeared on a cliff walk and the truth that emerged nearly 2 decades later became a beacon, not just for Rock Harbor, but for anyone who has ever faced the unknown and dared to seek the light beyond. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through a story of courage, truth, and healing. Your time and attention mean the world, and I hope this tale touched your heart as much as it did mine. If you found this story meaningful, please consider subscribing to the channel for more stories that inspire and connect us all. Don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts or personal stories in the comments below. I truly love hearing from you and learning about your experiences. Together, we create a community where every voice matters. Until next time, take care and keep the spirit of hope alive.